This is our last little bit before dinner this evening. And Sherry, I understand we're all on our own for dinner tonight, right? No schedule. Perfect. Great. Thanks. So this is our session panel discussion. So we're looking for any big observations, themes across the three presentations, big comments on the role of development, these sorts of things. Julia, please. Do you have a microphone? Oh, okay.
Okay, there we go. Yes, I really like the way the last session flowed into this one, but also how all the speakers' things fit together nicely. So I wanted to ask about payment for environmental services, which is, you know, kind of the holy grail. If we could, it's such an obvious thing that if it would work at scale, it would be great. One of the annoying things about getting older is that you have lots of perspective, and you remember that 30 years ago we all had the same hope, and it has still remained boutique and niche. So I wondered if anybody, and so I don't mean to be like one of those tried all that kind of old geezer types, but I would be interested to know if anyone has got perspective on getting it from boutique and cute and niche to scale. Thank you.
And we should say not every panelist has to answer every question. Just pick and choose if you think. And I'm passing it to you, not knowing you want to answer. So.
No, that's fine. I think that one of the key things was getting Treasury to agree that we could in principle use infrastructure finance for ecological infrastructure. So that is a big one. The challenge is that we don't have a lot of precedents. And the challenge is also that the money from the tariffs they tend to want it to go to central fiscus. So to try and keep it local is really difficult. The one mechanism that we are using is a smaller scale, which is called a water users association. And there what we have done is we've put these local coordinators into the water users associations. And then often we initially subsidize that, but they prove their worth locally to the local people who, the water users associations are the people who are paying the water tariffs. And then they can see a local difference, and then they are prepared to pay at least for the coordinator to leverage further ecological infrastructure work. But it's not easy, and we really need to get that fundamental shift where the catchment management agencies are budgeting for catchment management, because at the moment they say that they have zero budgeting, and so therefore they're often not increasing their prices, but they're not actually budgeting for the catchment management agencies. And we did calculations, and it's not a lot of the money that we're asking for. You know, as I say, it's under 5% of the water tariff, so it's not a lot that we need, but we do need that, and we need it to be allocated to catchment management, and it needs to be visible. And doing it via the water users associations has been good. It's a mandated body, and it's visible locally, so people kind of see that they're getting a return on their investment. Yeah.
So what's we have? Yeah, Diane.
Thank you. I just wanted to, it's more of a comment. Thank you so much for the presentations. I wanted to speak more on the, I guess, the institutional part of it, particularly on policy interventions and laws. And I think South Africa is a big outlier on the continent in terms of developing policies and developing laws, because a lot of the other countries, we once did a study on whether there's sufficient digital technology and climate change and agricultural policies and laws across Africa, and a lot of other governments are slacking behind. So automatically then you don't have political will, you don't have structures in place and institutions in place to help, you know, oversee a lot of the things. So I think that's definitely one thing I also wanted to contribute, but also I guess a lack of institutional capacity, particularly for private sector. So why, and donor dependency, that's another thing. So once the donor money is gone, it's for 5 years, it stops and that's it. Nothing happens from there. But sometimes then it's an aspect of they do not even have the institutional capacity to then regulate these kinds of things. They don't even know what is going on, or there's a lot of outsourcing that then needs to happen. And then continuity comes at play in terms of its, effectiveness. But now I just want to one little part on now bringing it to the women on the ground. And one of the barriers was around just in terms of the a lot of these climate smart technologies. One of the things that is often not considered, especially when they have it, is then the maintenance and when they break down, because they do not have the training and capacity to now fix a drone if it starts malfunctioning. So I'm left with a drone. The donor or the people that have brought this drone are gone. They are probably in the global north, and now I'm left with a drone that's not functioning. So there's also an aspect of, while the technology is being brought forward, there's a lack of training of just managing and maintaining those machineries, and then they just left unused.
I think I'll try to maybe contribute to the first part and a little bit of the last part of your input, Karabo. Thank you for that. I'd like to agree with you to say the policies or the laws are there, but the question of implementation, and I'll speak from a perspective of wanting to implement that we are working on a transboundary shared water source, like the Zambezi River Basin, and it goes for most river basin organizations out there, is that the existing agreements that the member countries have, it makes actually no provision for how they respond to climate change issues. And the reason we're speaking about catchment management and the payment for ecosystem services, it ties back to it is a climate change issue. So the agreements that exist, they were drafted many, many years ago, and it makes no provision for their collective action in terms of what action they should actually take to respond to that. And there's an exciting work that the AFDB is actually doing where they're in a consulting phase where they want to help the member countries to redraft their agreements over their shared water sources so that they can make amendments to have a climate change clause that would make it clear what mandate they can take collectively to respond to that. So that's why we left with an issue of, even if we approach now the 8 riparian states of the Zambezi River Basin, and you say we want to create a PES mechanism or whatever kind of funding, it kind of like there's no clear mandate for them to respond to that because it's not provided for in the existing agreement of that country. It may be a different situation with just one country like South Africa with the catchment management in Cape Town, but this is from the perspective of a transboundary environment, that the agreements are being relooked at. There is a proposal to amend them and have that mandate clarified in terms of their collective action. What is it that they're supposed to do, or how to do it? Do they have the mandate to do that, or maybe respond to the climate change issue? And then the other point about technology, gadgets, and all of that being taken to the rural communities or smallholder farmers and not being able to utilize them. I think when we want to include private sector or even entrepreneurs into those, I don't even want to call them projects, but in those deals that we're trying to facilitate, is we want a fertilizer provider or someone that has a stake in the value chain to be the one that provides the drone, because if it breaks, he is also affected, that I won't be able to monitor or communicate with the farmers, rather than it coming only or directly from the donor, because they're gone tomorrow and I wouldn't even know that it's broken. But if that service or the need comes or it's provided by the already existing people in the value chain, it could be a seed supplier, input supplier, be the one to give that, then they have an incentive to want to make sure that it works and it is serviced, because they also get a benefit out of the data that is being collected from the field.
Uh, Thank you. I have a question about Zambezi. In Stockholm, they spoke about it this year, how the different countries are actually trying to manage it all together. But I had a question and I didn't get an answer. I hope that you can help me. The aquifers in the area, I didn't get an answer how they're going to manage those aquifers all together as well. Are they going to use, let's say, flood water for recharging the aquifers through spate irrigation or different like basins that we saw yesterday in Cape Town to just collect flood water or not? And what is the major path to actually stop erosion as much as possible whenever floods hit that basin and many parts of that? Thank you.
Okay, about the aquifers, I know one, and it's an area where I post maybe the researchers, they are considering multiple ways of recharging the aquifers, and one of them is managing the degradation that is already happening so that we slow down the water, or maybe we slow down rain once it's hit the ground so that it gets a chance to percolate onto recharging groundwater. But then that's the study for us who are working at the confluence of water and agriculture to assess what are the volumetric numbers of enhanced conservation agriculture that is practiced by farmers for it to contribute to aquifer recharge. But at the same time, the Zambezi River Basin, with their strategic plan of up until 2040, they have a big investment plan called the PDAC Zambezi. It's mirrored after the AFDB project that is being implemented in the Niger Basin, where it's a massive investment plan that looks at infrastructure, refurbishment of certain dams. And I do know that we have contributed to some of the proposals that they are sending out, although I'm not very informed with the other components of the strategic plan, like the infrastructure. So I believe the recharging of the aquifers comes from the refurbishment of those infrastructures. But I do know that they are submitting a proposal to GCF. They are submitting a proposal to GF. But then broadly, what I would say they are, and not to speak for the government, but I would say what their focus area in terms of changing the situation or the challenges that face the Zambezi River Basin organization is to address the degradation that is happening at high scales across the basin, and addressing the degradation that will resolve in depletion of groundwater, that will address livelihoods, concerns, poverty, and all of that. So yeah, I'll say maybe have a look at the PDAC Zambezi program and see if it does, see which area exactly addresses that, but that is their main response to the issues that are happening in the basin, or the main investment plan that will take them forward up until 2040.
Can you hear me? Yes. I just wanted to ask a quick question. If the central government in South Africa supports these initiatives to basin watershed management, and in the water law, I assume you have a water law, is there a stipulation for supporting these initiatives, these type of initiatives?
Right. In the water law, the mechanism that is identified is those catchment management agencies. And that has been where the challenge has been in implementation. So they now are much bigger. So there was going to be 19, which would have been a finer scale of management. Now it is 6, and they're still busy rolling them out. So in terms of the legal frameworks, we've got the catchment management agencies, and then we've also got the water users associations. The water users associations are mandated in terms of law, and they used to be called irrigation boards, and those were not transformed. So that was the white farmers only, largely, and now they are transforming to water users associations, and there's a whole process around that transformation process. So the South African government does have in place, and we always try to work with the mandated authorities. So the catchment management agencies are part of those water source partnerships. The difference between the water source partnerships and the catchment management agencies is the catchment management agencies cover the whole landscape, whereas the water source partnerships just focus on those highest rainfall areas as a focus for activity. So they've got slightly different delineation, but the catchment management agencies are part of those water source partnerships, as are the Department of Agriculture, the conservation departments, and the local government authorities. So under law, the authorities are the catchment management agencies and the water users associations. That is what's under law, and also under law is recognize the importance of the strategic water source areas and the mechanisms to protect it, but not specifically the water source partnerships. That's not legally yet a specific mechanism.
Understood that by over irrigating, they lost the value of the fertilizer because it was leaching to below the root zone. As soon as they learned that fact, they halved the time they spent on irrigating and the amount of water they used, and doubled their yield. And that relates to the second driver, which is that farm families, one of their scarcest resources is labor. And irrigating for 3 hours in a round takes a whole day, because you have to walk 1 hour, 1.5 hours to the field, 1 or 1.5 hours back. So certainly they have a whole day more every second week that they can put to a different use. And I think these two benefits are the direct economic benefit to the farmer of adopting more efficient irrigation practices.
So I think that's also where the extension would come in, to convey that interface between the use of water and the implications for fertilizer and soils, etc. So yeah.
Is that okay now, Henning? Perfect. One of the joys of being an economist at an interdisciplinary conference is that whatever you say, first of all the non-economists pile onto you. And then after that, all the economists pile onto you, because that is our culture. So I want to particularly appreciate Johannes for taking all the heat there. I will say that efficiency, and the term efficiency in agricultural water use, is one of the most controversial topics. And I've probably been in more arguments about what efficiency and productivity means. And it might be something that's worth us considering as a group. And I think part of the problem is that it is context specific. And what the appropriate measure of efficiency or productivity is really depends on the context that you're looking at. And so that's sort of the framing. So really, I'd like to try to ask a question at a high level, which is to do with the overall conference topic, which is this, that we think about efficiency, we think about conservation. And Caroline, you made a very good comment earlier that it's not enough just to think about what the water is doing for welfare and for income and for farmers, but also we need to think about conservation and environmental uses. In much of the continent of Africa, and I also want to be very careful, we're talking a lot about Africa, and Africa should or shouldn't. Africa is a continent with many, many different countries and many, many different contexts. So in many of the contexts existing in some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, the goal of policy, the goal of development banks is to increase irrigation as quickly as possible because there are plentiful water resources, and typically there aren't compelling water quality issues. However, if you're successful, you will have water quantity problems and you will have water quality problems. And so one of the questions that I have for the group is how, within the situations you're familiar with in the Global South, do you manage that trade-off? That at the beginning, at some level, really, you want to encourage people to adopt technologies. But at some point, the issue of governance, the issue of dealing with water quality issues related to agricultural water management become very complex indeed. And what are the ways, and that's particularly so when you're dealing with smallholders, where governance of smallholders is almost impossible in many cases. So I'm interested to hear, maybe not just from the panelists, but from anybody in the room that would care to comment. Thank you.
Anyone do? Well, first part, thanks, appreciate it, no hard feelings. The second part, yes, I mean, you first incentivize them to adopt the technology, but then I think it's about monitoring. But we would have to talk specifically about the technology. I'm not sure you describe technology that increases water use efficiency at the beginning, but then we run into water quantity problems and environmental. So, well, then you set a cap to the amount that each farmer could use, basically. But then it's then a question of water quantity, water pricing, water evaluation again. So, hopefully this was an answer.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nick. I mean, there's so many things we can do. All right. First of all, I'll start with a comment. 95% of research money goes into irrigation. To me, that's criminal for a start. Okay, so that's a broad institutional governance issue that really needs to be fixed. So that's the broad thing. Where are we putting our money? Where are we putting our effort? Where can we get the best return? So those things are things that we have to consider. And then just coming back to our basic point I made before, if we're investing in money, we have to invest in where we're going to get the biggest public return. And public return includes private productivity benefits. It includes ecosystems. It includes other governance and social returns and economic development. And, if we're doing proper analyses of these returns, to me, from all the evidence I've seen, if we have to make a broad classification of where we're going to put our time and money, if we're talking grey infrastructure versus green infrastructure, and green infrastructure involves knowledge and skills a lot more than grey infrastructure does, there is no debate. It should be going towards green infrastructure. That's just my 2 cents.
It's a very good point. This points to the trade-off analysis you should apply for many investments. We did a study for the World Bank on nature-based solutions, so we did a trade-off analysis. The environmental consequences of investing in more nature-based solutions, but also the performance consequences on farmer side. It's often overlooked and cannot be measured, but we try to measure it. So it's a very good example for a trade-off analysis at different scales. So you have different values. Some of them you have prices, others you have to use non-market valuation, which I try to outline in my presentation. Then it gets more complicated, but there are multiple of values, and there you have trade-off synergies between values, and these are a function of scale. These are a function of context, of different other factors. So fully agree.
To get a clarification again, I'm not in the field. I think what you're suggesting is really, these are all situation dependent and site specific, right? For each of these different things, you have to really develop a particular solution. Is that what you're saying?
Tricky. Not necessarily. I think there are factors that would play a role cross context, cross technologies, cross experiments, and there are other factors that are context or technology or location, institutional framework specific. But there are lots of studies that try to figure out and measure those non-specific factors. And there's a lot of evidence out there that the policymakers can at least have a go on those.
The issues that are cross-cutting are specific. It applies to everything. The ones that are really not specific to a particular case could be the breaking points, right? In implementation to get to the end.
Breaking point in terms of triggering point, or when innovation takes off, or?
Yes, well, you said some of them are, the answer to my question was not necessarily. You said some of those attributes are cross-cutting, and there are some that could be very specific to each situation. So the question is, which ones really result in a failure of implementing policy in some place? Let's say if it's an agricultural thing, you bring a new technology. There was this talk about the drone, right? The drone didn't fail. That obviously is a specific issue that needs to be addressed. If it doesn't, unfortunately, it's a weak link and it breaks the project as a whole. That's my point.
Yes, but it's a good point from many technologies. The support of the adoption is based on assuming there is a market, there is someone who wants to pay for this product, and we talked also a bit over lunch about this. So the value chain or the creation of value addition has to be there. But I think this is also acknowledged. If you check the calls that are out there for research projects, is always about including stakeholders and a component of creating a kind of value addition afterwards. So creating not only the product, the technology, or the adoption, but also making it marketable.
Okay, so well, this is just up to Johannes' presentation and also Shanani's presentation and the discussion we've had for the last 45 minutes, and also what Ariel said, I think that was this morning, about information. Because it's quite true, the factors that Johannes listed have been documented in the literature as constraints that have prevented smallholder farmers from adopting new technologies, and that has these issues have had immense impacts on the welfare of smallholder farmers. But if we think about adoption of conservation technologies, then we will notice that the literature has taken a different path. I mean, the previous literature focused on the role of property rights, institutions, property rights, how they impact on adoption of these conservation measures. The recent literature tend to focus on information. That means information social networks, How do social networks impact on the adoption of new technologies, and then the impact of this adoption on household welfare. So that is quite important. And the question is, I mean, you talked about how you've tried to promote adoption of technologies. I don't know to what extent you've considered this issue, because if you think about extension, then you realize that in some African countries, you have one farmer to one extension officer to about 1,800 farmers. So the extension officers are not very effective in this direction. So people emphasize in the research on information social networks. So the question is, how can policy use these kind of research findings to promote the adoption of these kind of technologies you were talking of?
Okay. It was more of a comment, and I think from just being on the ground with the farmers and the NGOs that work with the farmers, I feel like the advocacy has actually been quite successful in the farmer communities. And that's why maybe I focus my presentation more on the funding aspect of it, to promote them to adopt it. They're not adopting it because they do not see the benefits of the improved yields or the environmental benefits, but for them to be incentivized for the hard labor that it comes with for them to adopt those activities, or to just be assisted in adopting some of the technologies, because like I said, some of them, it is back-breaking. Some families cannot manage breaking the pan on the ground when they need to do that. They need some assistance with some mechanization, and they don't have the funding at all to fund that. So I think the advocacy, like you're saying, more towards to policy, so that it also does not look like the policy contradicts, because we're also being received as if you are fighting against irrigation on the continent. Can there be policy harmonization in promoting conservation agriculture without seeming like we're an opponent of big scale farming? So yeah, I think the advocacy is more towards the policymakers and the financiers that needs to support the farmers. I think farmers are fully game on it.
You want me to go on? Okay.
So one of the mechanisms that can be useful is to work with the youth in agricultural communities. So they often are easier to adopt, and we have youth champions that work with their communities. And something that one of our local researchers indicated is the kind of paradox of hungry youth and fallow land, and how do we empower the youth around the knowledge around sustainable production. So it's important to bring the youth angle in.
Mine is just a contribution. One thing that I've noted is that majority of farmers, especially in this country, are more knowledgeable compared to extension officers. And some of the extension officers are even afraid to go to the community to face those farmers. It's a fact. I don't know if maybe we need to retrain them, reskill, I mean, whatever ways we can play around with. But the bottom line is that we've got problems. I think we need to fix our education system. And the question is, are we producing relevant graduates that are meeting the market demand or industrial demand? I'm raising this based on the fact that I've been interacting with the majority of smallholder farmers, and they've indicated that, look, these extension officers are just wasting our time. They are not really adding any value. And especially when it comes to issues related to climate change. Remember, this is just a new focus area that has emerged. It's only few of us, I mean, who were fortunate to just jump into the queue and be trained in that field. But the issue of education, awareness, and also being proactive is very, very important, especially if we want to jack up our extension services. We still have got a long way to go, because the knowledge that we generate, it's supposed to be taken by extension of, officers as part of the knowledge uptake. But if those guys are not up to the game, then it means that somehow we need to train scientists to become extension officers. That's my contribution. Thank you.
So I cannot resist. Actually, I think I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm going to say that I totally agree with you. And it is a big problem. It's a problem in some places in the US too. I cannot resist giving a plug for the way that we manage cooperative extension in California, which is radically different than almost every other state in the United States. Most states have cooperative extension scientists, researchers at the campus. And then they hand off content to the agents who aren't developing the content. They're just sharing it. They're extending it, their extension. In California, we have scientists at the campuses. We also have cooperative extension advisors in every single county, all the field, who are required to have a robust research program. They have to be scientists. They have to do research. They have to develop content. And then when they're leading workshops and delivering content, they're up to speed. And they have different relationships with the campus-based scientists because they're working together more often. And I personally think that's one of the reasons we've had such a successful agricultural sector in California, is those folks in the field working day to day, every day, hand in glove with the farmers, with the communities, with their stakeholders. In fact, other states in the US are looking at our model and trying to figure out if maybe that's what they ought to be doing too.
Can I respond to that quickly? So I think that speaks to a very important thing of that extension is often seen as a career entry position. So, I mean, I've spoken about the youth, but there's another side is that there is this wisdom of being on the land, and there's a tremendous need to create career pathing for extension so that the natural progression is not that as you progress in wisdom and extension that you go to the central office, but that you stay in place and then mentor the young people. Because the thing about extension is you go out into the middle of nowhere and then you must like have traction. And that really is so much driven by personal motivation, because you can go out and do nothing, or you can go out and have a meaningful cup of tea or meaningful beer. And there's a very qualitative difference between the two, and it's driven entirely by internal motivation and that added wisdom. And there is that need for additional training around climate change, and also that top-down approach to extension that used to be the modus operandi. Now extension is maybe more about getting together farmer groups with the smallholder farmers. We're doing a pilot project. We're getting the smallholder farmers and the commercial farmers in an area together to learn from each other. And so the extension officer's role is not to teach, but to facilitate.
Thank you. I'll try not to detract from some of this energy from this discussion. I wanted to go back to this topic of green water, so plant available water. And back in 2009, when the planetary boundaries research came out, freshwater change, global freshwater change, was one of the 9 boundaries. And at that point in 2009, the assessment was such that the freshwater availability boundary had not been transgressed. And so we were, in the zone of risk, but still okay. Now the latest planetary boundaries framework paper came out just last month in September 2023. And not only do we have the realization that we've surpassed the freshwater availability planetary boundary, but there's been an update to the indicators that are used for it. And so now we have blue and green water as separate thresholds. And blue water is worse off than green water, but both have sort of reached unsustainable limits. And so if we think about ecologically available water and policy instruments and tools that can be used, we're now operating, unfortunately, in crisis mode. And I'm one of the biggest fans of collaboration and cooperation, bottom-up voluntary initiatives. But if we're at a point where that's not effective anymore to maintain healthy functioning ecosystems, I'm sort of wondering, and maybe this is more of a rhetorical question than anything, and something that I think about in my research, but I'm also wondering if the panelists have any insight on policy instruments that could address plant available water, ecologically available water, and at what point do we start talking about abstraction limits and top-down command and control type policy instruments if voluntary ones aren't working? Thank you.
Well, we have like 5 actually, but Nick, you know. Okay.
Thank you for the nice presentations. Perhaps not a question, but a few comments. When I listened to the presentation about the factors actually driving adoption of irrigation technologies, also, you know, in kind of water conservation technologies, I was thinking about the bundling aspect to it. Not only bundling different technologies, but actually bundling different interventions that might lead to the adoption of the technology per se. Whether in your work, you come across experiences throughout your projects whereby you really have observed a significant difference between interventions that were sort of standalone based and those that had a bundling process. The second question that I wanted to raise was related to, you know, the tipping point related to how different interventions are phased, are structured. Because when we talk about making sure that the communities in which we operate, they buy in the, you know, different interventions we're bringing down there, literally it will get to a point where, you know, the donor will leave and the technologies will stay, and we need to maintain them, we need to manage them, and we need to own them. And many of our previous experiences, what we have observed was because actually people were not involved from the design perspective when those projects were being implemented. As a result of that, it means we did not really cater for a need assessment. You know, people, they copy and paste. And by copying and pasting, it does not match the reality on the ground. I mean, from both sides, people, they kind of complain because the funder is saying, okay, I'm giving a lot of money and I'm not seeing any result. But the community, they're also saying, well, we have not been involved from the beginning. Then I think there is a need to clearly identify that tipping point that links, you know, the funder and the community. I mean, I don't know whether you have questions or not, but this is what I wanted to put on the table. Thank you.
I think it's a very good point that GB makes. That gives me an idea for a new paper. Yes, I think the targeting of adoption advice or of extension, I think that's another point. So targeting the adoption of certain technologies, given the need you said, we have to find indicators for the need, economic need or in sustainability need, or. But that's in the end, it's targeting adoption probability you would like to raise by extension, by information, or by selecting subsidies and advice to based on certain user characteristics. The bundling is also very. There are examples where I know examples from India where the takeoff or the conversion to organic agriculture was linked to drip irrigation. So this worked very well. So yes.
I think your point is very good, and that the partnerships help with both things, because firstly they identify local needs and respond to them. So it's not donor driven. They say what is their key issues and how do they want to respond, and then it tends to lead to a number of interrelated interventions. So you get rangeland management going together with spring protection, etc. So and then more and more people want to be part of that. Yeah.
I just have this 2 comments about community management. Community involvement. And first thing, I think for the technological adoption, there are 2 kinds of incentive. One is economic incentive, And the second one is social incentive, including like social learning, network effects, or social capital, which include like social sanction when someone over extracts the water. And by doing community involvement, we can increase the social incentive, not only in line with some project with communities benefit, and also increase the sustainability of the projects. And for the second one is, I'm wondering who participate community involvement. More educated people in the community or more vulnerable people. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
I'd say maybe regarding community engagement, what we have seen is that when we visit the farmers themselves, in terms of participation, and I think it also is a cultural thing, you just get there and you see all the women on the one side and the men on the one side. And in terms of their participation, the women usually don't speak up first. And I think that's also a cultural thing that you need to take cognizant of. They will just sit looking like they're timid, but then they're actually the ones on the forefront of doing the activities. And perhaps when, let's say there's some kind of an external person coming with either there's a need to sign for something, that's when you see that they are the ones who practice as farmers, but then they'll either call their male son, their male children or the husbands to be the one who are the face of whatever deal or whatever discussion that is going on. But then it was also very interesting that in a community that we went to I think it's in Malawi, where it's a matriarchal community where there's women who are chiefs. In that community, the women were empowered. And I think it's also a cultural thing. So be context specific, but I would say broadly and generally, we do find that women tend to be the forefront managers themselves in the farms, but then in terms of like active participation, they don't. And if there's also a need to sign up something because they do not have the collateral, they also don't benefit, because those benefits will come through whoever that signed, who is the land is registered under their names. So that's just one example from the field that we've come from. Yeah, I don't think the other ones were, I appreciated inputs.
Okay, thank you all for your presentations. I just wanted to go back a little bit, maybe even to the beginning of our session today when Andrea brought up the issue of the importance of information sharing. I think the last few moments will be sort of the things we've been saying here touches on that point as well. And what I want to point out is what Sylvester said and the follow-up to it, disconnect between funders and people on the ground. It seems to convey to me an informational problem. Is there, so, and I think this question, there are many of you already working on projects on the ground in various parts of the continent. If I've introduced myself to you here, I've probably said something along the lines of, oh, I've been to other African countries in recent years to collect data on the enforcement of environmental regulations, but I found nothing. And this seems to be a common theme. So for those of you who work on projects on the continent, what do you think? What do you see on the ground? So when you are making a judgment on whether or not your project is succeeding, what type of information are you using? What type of data do you collect to make that assessment?
This is my first time with the microphone and it's working. Yes. So I guess I want to bring it back to Nick's question or kind of comment in terms of, once a technology is introduced, if you're successful, then, that brings about challenges. And, being from Nebraska, you think of the groundwater pump and, center irrigation. And then, many decades later, then you develop these institutions to then manage the resource. And then it made me think of Lucia's question in terms of, is there a different pathway forward? And I think all of the comments that I've heard today, it makes me think of the role of governance and institutions. And I can't help but thinking about Eleanor Ostrom's and her 8 design principles and, that foundational work. And I think we do have an opportunity, especially in, the more developing areas, about how do we build these strong institutions and governance systems and share information and build trust and develop enforcement mechanisms and actually understand what we're trying to manage for in advance of the technological innovations or revolutions that are no doubt in the future. And so I think there's an opportunity to think more about that as we move forward. And Caroline, bringing it back to your question, I 100% agree. So many times we want to fund projects. What are the outputs? But how do we build the strong foundations to then ensure that those projects are successful? And then how can we change how we think about incentives and investments to make that happen into the future? So it's just not financing that drop, but it's, financing the foundation that will enable those drops to stay there in the future.
Perfect way to end it. I mean, really, if there's panelists for
yes, thank you for sharing it. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, I think it was a great day. We have one more day to go, and hopefully it will be as lively and productive as it was today. Just one thing about governance, when we talk about governance and institutions, in the context of the conversations, I think there is already an assumption that institutions are honest and governance is implemented based on the rules and regulations that have been implemented. Unfortunately, in most of the developing countries, governance and institutions are not going to serve the people. There are bribes, bakshish, or whatever you want to call it, that completely throws a lot of these things out of kilter, and the efficiency doesn't work. So speaking as someone coming from Iran and from a family that has been involved in farming for years, I can tell you, as this very moment, probably somebody's getting so many thousands of dollars in order to ignore how much groundwater is being pumped out of the ground. Okay, so other thing is, we were talking about technologies today. A good example of it, we experienced all year, was we had a distributed system of microphones on the tables. Okay, so homework for tonight. Tell me, was it because of the educational aspect that we don't know how the hell to operate these things? Or is it because this technology has its own problems, unless Sherry is around the room walking with this so that we can all behave properly? So, but the microphones you can leave, don't worry about it. I don't think they're going to go away. So, the table setting, I think people are getting used to each other, becoming friendly. I think it's okay, right? People are going to maintain the setting that is there. And create less work for you. The other thing is, tomorrow, if you don't mind, we're going to have a group picture. If you want to have in your best looks, I'm just giving you the heads up that sometimes tomorrow, between after breakfast to the lunchtime, we will take a group photo. And these photos are extremely important because Glenda uses that to tell us how great we are. And so with that, enjoy your evening. You're on your own. Don't do something wild and crazy so that you will have over headaches, etc. by tomorrow morning. Okay?